Welcome to our training video on budget form creation. Budgets are very advanced forms. You really should feel pretty comfortable in creating standard forms before you attempt to build a budget form. What you have to understand is that as you're building your budget form, typically at the application level, you're actually building your claim form at the same time and how that budget appears at the claim. So it's a very neat form. It's pretty cool, but you're actually defining your claim reimbursement form at the same time that you're building your application budget form. So that's one key piece that you have to understand. I'm going to also show you some things that I've seen done wrong. One of the biggest things is always test first. It is critical to understand that just because your budget looks great at the application level does not mean that you're ready to post and go live with that funding opportunity. To really test a brand new budget, you should take your test application into grant tracking and start a claim. And then you'll really see how that budget is looking through the life cycle, because again, it's developing your claim reimbursement form. So you can't really say that you've approved your budget and you're ready to use it until you've seen it from all sides. Okay, so the first place I'm going to take you is the funding opportunities. I'm going to log in. Again, your funding opportunity controls all your forms. And I just want to show you a mistake that I see a lot of people make that are, they're really good at testing. They do great at testing in the application, and then they just kind of stop testing from there. If everything looks good at the application, then they think they're done testing. I cannot stress it enough. You need to test it through the entire life cycle. So here's an example I see some people do. So they'll take their old funding opportunity, right? And so it has all of these forms in here. And what they'll do, and this is one of the easiest ways to create a funding opportunity, is they're just going to copy it. So they'll copy, and then they'll put it in test status and go change the deadlines maybe. Let's see. Change these deadlines, change the award. And it's like the easiest way to create a funding opportunity. Oh, the forms come over, and it literally takes like a minute. It's so easy. Then you run a test through. It's great. It really is, until you start swapping and changing out your forms. And then it's kind of a headache because you took a copy. So like I still have the same 4 forms I used. I happened to copy, I think, 2022. So those same forms came over, which is great. Like I said, until you start creating new forms and wanting to remove these, and then it like becomes a mess in the grant tab. So we have to follow these forms all the way through. In this particular case, I have 3 application forms copied to the grant. Well, in this scenario where I see this mistake a lot is they do the proper testing at the application. And they'll say, well, I've created a new budget, so I'm going to remove this budget. Okay, and then they add their new budget. Then they go test, and everything looks and works great. But then they stop testing, and they award into grant tracking. And then at the grant level, guess what? It still has the old budget. And now the budget data didn't link, because you have a new budget at the application, an old budget at the grant, and then guess what? Your claim form's all messed up too. So before you use something, test it. So in this case, before you go into grant tracking, it's critical that you've taken your test application into grant tracking first, and you'll quickly realize that your budget is blank, it's not the right budget, and you can go link your new budget, set up your grant tab, and it's a very quick fix if you test properly. Now, I have some people panic and go, so I have to test the entire life cycle before I can post? No, you just have to test what you're going to use before you use it. So to post a funding opportunity to accept applications, you only have to test and approve your application forms, right? And then you would be, testing your review forms if you're going to use the review process. And then you would test grant tracking before you award your applications into grant tracking, and so on. So you just need to test it and approve it essentially before you use it. That's it. But this is a very common mistake I see. And then they'll end up sometimes with 2 budgets, and it's just a mess. So just test it all the way through. Again, that was an example. I'm going to go back to my previous funding opportunity. I was using this one. So in this case, this is the one I used in the other form creator trainings. And we have a copied form and then a brand new form that I built in those trainings. So I don't actually have a budget. And it's always recommended that you only have one budget and a funding opportunity. The claim does concatenate all the budgets together. So if you would have more than one, it puts it all together as one claim reimbursement form. It's not like one budget. If I had 2 budgets, I wouldn't have 2 different claim forms. It would push them all together. Now, if that is your intention, you can have 2 budgets. And I have seen that done, but it was intentional and it's pretty rare. Typically, you will have one budget and only one form defined as a budget in each of your funding opportunities. Okay, so now I get to go to the fun part and actually go to the form creator. So I've actually already got that pulled up. I'm in my training program area, starting at the application. Okay, so I'm going to start from scratch. So I'm going to click Add. And here, this is where your form type needs to be budget. If you accidentally create it as a standard form first and then you switch it, it's not going to work. So you have to make sure it's defined as a budget form first. It's truly a different type of form to the system. As soon as you identify it as a budget, it immediately knows that it's going to pull into the claim. Okay, so it's really important that you define it as a budget initially. You can order it whatever. And then I see almost every budget in the system is named budget. So try to make it a little more precise. Maybe name it by program, like training budget or something like that, to where you can tell them apart. But definitely use a form description if you're going to name it budget. So I'll go ahead and name mine budget like everybody does. And then I'll say new training budget. New training budget for 23 FO. This is where you always come back, and I highly recommend you archive your old forms and clean them up. But it's going to be a standard final application form, but it's going to be a budget form. Okay, so now I have created my form, and this is where we're going to go in, add our sections and our fields, and it's kind of the same, but you have to understand that you're defining your claim form. So there are 2 ways to really set up a section in a budget. One is to define it as a true budget section, and one is just a standard informational only section. And the difference is a true budget section is what's going to pull into the claim, and then your informational standard sections will not. And a lot of times you don't want everything to pull into the claim. So a lot of times on a budget, you'll have like a justification. They're going to, have their actual budgets, line items, and all, categorized and everything, and then have a justification. And then maybe you'll have another section at the bottom that summarizes and gives you the grand total. Well, let's take that example. If you take the grand total section and you actually define it as a budget, then it's going to pull in all the categories and sections that are split out, by line items, by category, plus the summary. What it ends up doing is it duplicates your awarded amount, because you technically have the actual budget sections, and then you've duplicated your summary and you pulled it all into the claim, and it'll double the awarded amount. So I'm going to show you how to build this correctly. First, we're going to start by defining our budget sections. Now, you could start the other way. You could start with an informational section. You really have to know you can't just come in here and build a budget. You have to have an idea of what types of categories you allow in your budget, whether or not you're tracking match, how detailed you want your claim to be, because you really have to know your claim details at the point that you're building your application budget. I have seen budgets usually defined 3 different ways, and it may sound, well, 3 is not very many. Oh, there's hundreds of different ways to build a budget, but the 3 main ways when it comes down to the claim, you really have 3 options. A total summary that they're claiming against, so not by category or line item at all. Another option is to do it by line item, which is the individual line items underneath the category. So that's a very strict budget. So an example of what I mean by line item is line items underneath of a category. So if I have the category supplies, equipment, and travel on my budget, all the individual supplies and all the individual places they traveled are the line items underneath. So you're holding them very strictly to the line items. That's going to be a pretty large budget, a pretty large claim. But some requirements in certain programs require you to get it down to that nitty-gritty level of detail. And then the final option is at a category level. So you might ask them to provide you with the line item detail at the application, but you don't necessarily hold them to the line item detail at the claim. So you're more doing a category level budget. So yeah, you're asking for this information and it's just a standard section where you're gathering the information on the line items underneath salary, equipment, and travel. But when it comes to the claim, the true budget sections that are defined as a budget are just the categories. So they pull in as a category subtotal, not each supply they want to purchase and not each place they travel. So in this scenario, I am going to build a line item budget. So I'm going to split out each category into its own section. They will all be defined as budget sections when it comes to the category, and I'm going to pull those line items into it. And then I'll kind of explain based on this budget build how you could build those other types that I was discussing. So we're going to go ahead and begin by adding a new section. Okay, so this is the important box right here, and you have to do it the first time you add a new section. You cannot come back and change this later, okay? But this is what defines it as a true budget section if it's not checked. So if I click save right now, I'm in a budget section. If I check the box, then I'm in a standard informational only section that will not pull into the claim. And again, this is where you have to know what you require at the claim in order to define this budget. So I'm doing an actual budget section. So I don't want to check the box. And then I'm going to do, again, categories and line items. So I'm going to make a section per category. So this is going to be typical categories. It's not specific to any one client, but it's pretty typical categories that you'll see. Now, I've seen grid budgets and multi-list budgets the most, but in this case, it's going to look a little odd. But I am going to do both. Typically, you would do one. You would say, oh, I'm going to do a multi-list or I'm going to do grid. But I'm going to do both just so you can visualize what you would need for yours. A multi-list will end up looking like a grid. It's what I like to call a user-defined grid. Once they add their rows to it, it'll end up looking like a grid. I'm going to go ahead and add both. So multi-list, we're going to do salary. And I saw one pop up that I used. Salary and fringe. So that's going to be a multi-list. And I'm going to click save. Okay. Underneath here, your text one, that's going to be the first field you usually add is your text. Or maybe you have a drop-down list of particular items that you want to provide them instead of an open text. But it'll end up being a text field, whether it's a drop-down or not, and I'll show you this. When I click add and I'm in a budget section, it's a little bit different than my normal sections. So the first thing I noticed is I don't have a database field name. So it's going to define the database field names for me because I'm in a budget section and they have to be very specific. And then I have very limited data types. There's a lot of functionality within a budget. So it's not the same list that you saw in your standard section. You cannot do conditional logic in a budget. In fact, you can't hide anything in a budget because if you hide it, it may not show at the application, but everything's going to show at the claim. So make sure you use the appropriate budget and you're not trying to, take one from a different program and just hide a few things. You really need to define it for your own program. It's all going to show and there's no conditional logic that you can add in a true budget section. So in this case, I would say, well, if I'm saying salary and fringe, I want them to list, maybe the name and the title for the person they're paying salaries on for their project, and then whether or not I want to track match on the budget or not. So I'm going to first do a text, and I'm going to say name, and then whether or not you require it. Now remember, in a multi-list, this is why you really need standard form training before you can dig into these. But a multi-list, you have to require your fields that you want required after they click add. They only apply when they click add though. So I'm going to click save. I've just asked them the name. Then you can add some other fields, you don't have to, but you can say title or position or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and go position. Require it. Click save. And then we always have to have our currency fields, right? So we're going to say it could be that we're not tracking match. So it's just the total amount that we're paying on this person. Or it could get really in detail. You know, we could be asking, well, how much is their hourly wage? And then how many hours do they work? And then get a total. And then out of that, how much is, you know, the retirement? And you can get really crazy here with the questions you ask. But the simple fact is you have to direct the system on what field, which currency field you're pulling into the claim, because you might, like I just gave a good example of many currency fields, you might have many on one form, so you have to tell it which one is the true awarded amount. And then if you're tracking match and your grantee needs to claim match, then you need to direct the system on which currency field is the match amount too. So defining your currency fields is just like adding another normal field. It's the thing we have to do after the currency fields. So I'm going to go ahead and create a budget with match so you can see it both ways, but you do not have to track match. So I'm going to just go pretty simple on this. I'm going to go requested amount. Pretty simple. I'm not asking about, you know, fringe and retirement and all that, though I could. I'm just going to go requested amount and match amount. How much, you know, for the salary is going to be paid by the amount that you're asking of me versus match. So it's a currency field, requiring it. Now in a multi-list or a grid, you're probably going to want to include total so it shows at the bottom. Then I'll do the same thing. I'm tracking match. And match doesn't necessarily have to say the word match. It could be in kind or whatever, but it's very important to understand that match is tracked differently in the system. And what it means to the system is it's the amount of money that you're not funding on the project. Okay, and it's only for those projects that would be tracking other funding. If you don't have to track other funding, you don't have to add match. So this could say other funding or in kind, but I'm going to go ahead and just call it match amount. And again, it's a currency. I'm going to go ahead and include totals because it's a multi-list will have multiple rows and require it. So here's a pretty typical standard section for a budget. Now this is the important part. This is where you direct the system on what is what as far as the claim. So the user, the applicant's only going to see these 4 fields. So you're actually going to hide the awarded amount and match total fields. These 2 fields I'm going to show you is what's going to pull it into the claim. So we're going to click add new field. I immediately select not show, and I'll go awarded amount. And I'm actually going to define it as the awarded amount. The awarded amount and the match total are the special fields that pull that amount into the claim. And then it's going to end up being a calculation. So you're going to direct it to the field. In this case, it's nothing fancy. It's just the cost 1. And then my cost 2 is my match. It could be a calculation, like it could be their hourly wage times the hours worked. And in this case, it's just very simple. So that's a system field I added to tell the system what to pull into the claim for the awarded amount. Now we're going to do the same thing for match. And say pull this into the match columns. And then that one happens to be cost 2. Pretty simple. So that section is done. I'm going to go ahead and add an equipment section. And then I will add specific equipment items in my grid rows, just to show you an example of how a grid budget would be set up. So this time I am still not going to make it a standard section. And this will be equipment. Now, most of the time you see a grid budget, it's usually a budget that's only tracking categories, not line items, and the rows themselves would be the salary, equipment, travel, supplies. Or you can make it very specific, like I'm about to, for very specific items. Because remember, in a grid, they can't define the rows themselves. So this will make a little bit more sense when I pull it into an application and show you what it looks like. I'm going to say equipment, grid, save. Then I'm going to pretty much have the same field. So I'll have like a text field for a description. No, I won't. I'm wrong. In this case, because we have our rows, we really don't need a description. You could add a text field for a description. And I'm going to list specific items though. So I don't know, maybe a justification would be needed for item. You could do this, you could do without it. So that's going to be my text. I'm not going to require that one. And then again, I'm going to say, okay, how much is the awarded amount? Or sorry, requested total might be better. Requested total. You see budgets built in many different ways, and it just depends on the verbiage you want to use. It's going to be multiple rows again because it's a grid. So I'm going to include the totals at the bottom. And maybe match isn't required. And once again, I'm going to add those system fields, awarded amount and match amount. For the system to pull it into the claim. Okay. I said I was going to limit them in this grid to the specific rows instead of just letting them add rows like I would in a multi-list. I'm going to define the rows. So some kind of basic office equipment is what I'm going to list. Again, this is just an example. So we'll say computer, printer, maybe a scanner. Okay, so now what this looks like in the preview is now they're limited to this. They don't have like an add button where they can add multiple. It's very strict to these particular rows. When I get in an application, you'll see I have an add button up here and I can name many. So I could have built my equipment section the same way, where they have the option to add a computer or not. They could totally skip it. So it really depends on your needs on how you build them. But I highly recommend if you're just starting out, set up a couple test funding opportunities. Remember, you don't want to throw multiple budgets in the same funding opportunity, but set up a couple funding opportunities and test status and build some simple budgets. Like you just need one section to see how it's going to work and flow, and build them a little bit differently. Take it into the claim and you'll quickly see how it looks and what you prefer and what works best for your program. This one is kind of mixed and matched, which you probably wouldn't do on an actual real budget, but I want to make sure you see the different options. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say that I only allow salary, fringe, and equipment. Most time you'll keep adding. You'll keep, you add your, if you allow supplies, travel, and so on, you'll add those sections in there. And I'm going to say this is it. This is all I allow. But I'm going to say this is it. This is all I allow. So I am going to now show you a standard section. And there's a couple of reasons for a standard section. I pointed them out earlier. I'm going to kind of do both. So generally, this isn't all you want to capture on your budget. And if you notice, if I just click on one of these, I don't have like an area for a big text box. This is a very, standard regular size text box because it's pulling into the claim reimbursement form. So you would never pull in like the justification, which may be multiple paragraphs, into the claim reimbursement form, right? You just want the line. At this point, we're building an application budget where they're requesting it, but eventually we'll go through a review of this budget. We might adjust this budget down, but we would approve their budget line items when we pull it into the grant, and then we'll pull that budget into the claim and they'll claim against it. That large justification should, be there if I need to refer back to it, but we're really just wanting them to claim against their approved budget and their simple line items. So if you do need a justification, you can get kind of fancy with your justifications. You can do a multi-list by category or however. Sometimes it's just a big box. Again, that's a lot of its preference. But the most important thing to note is it has to be a standard section. We don't want it pulling into the claim. It's not going to make sense to pull this into the claim. First off, it'd be a little tiny text box. I won't have the ability to add a big text box if it's not standard. And second, I'm not going to have any currency fields, so it really doesn't make sense to pull a justification in without currency fields. You'll see what I mean after I do this. So I check that box. That's a standard section. I'm going to name it budget justification. In this case, it's just going to be a regular single value. What happens now is when I click add field now, it's like adding a field in a regular section on a standard form. And that's basically what this is. Even though you're in a budget, you're defining a standard section. So my database field name is back, all my data types, and I'm free pretty much to do what I want in here. It's not going to impact the claim in any way. The biggest mistake you could make is making it a budget section accidentally. And I see people do this a lot with their summaries. A lot of people want to add all their categories together at the bottom and have a budget summary and then do a match percentage and all kinds of stuff at the end of their budget. And that's fine, but make sure it's a standard section or else it's going to pull into the claim too. And then you'll have all your category listings with that amount, and then it'll double because you've got the grand total at the bottom. So your grand total, if you're doing that, needs to be in a standard section like this. And I'm just going to make a big box. I will give them lots of room to work with here. And that's it for that. And then I know that will not pull into the claim. And then we'll go ahead and do a quick total. So again, standard section. I'm going to call it totals, single value. And here it's at the bottom. And again, it's a standard section. So when I click add, it looks like a normal field. So I'm going to go total requested. This would be a currency. And then we'll go total match. Again, currency. Now I do have to write these calculations up. I have to tell it which sections and which fields to add for each of these. The calculation training was in a separate video. So make sure again that you feel pretty comfortable with standard forms and calculations and all that before you attempt a budget. So I'm going to go back and add the calculations for these. But I'm just adding the fields for now. This would be my grand total or total project, whatever you'd like to call it, with requested amount and match total together. And then I'll go ahead and do a percentage of match too. I see this on a lot of budgets that track match. And that would be a percentage. So it depends on what you're calculating. So I'm going to go back in now and add these calculations for each of these fields really quick. Okay, now the calculations have been added, so I'm going to quickly show you them just so you can have an idea of what I did with my calculations. No spaces, and they have to be exact. So that's our total requested, pulling both of the cost ones from both sections. And then our total match, same section references, but now we're pulling our cost 2 fields and just totaling those. And then I wanted to add them together. So I've got my grand total. You'll see both cost ones and both cost twos. And then I did my percentage of match. This one has some order of operations, so you'll see some parentheses in there. This one gets a little large, but it's match divided by total budget. So that's match plus awarded times 100 to create that percentage. So what's next? Well, I've got some budget sections. I've got a justification in here. I really need to go test this. I also want to just show you what it looks like, get a feel for it. But ultimately, I have to link this budget to the grant. And then I have to take that application into grant tracking and do a claim. So I'm going to show you that. What's our first step? We have to add it to the funding opportunity. Right now, this form is not in use. Head over to the funding opportunity, go to the application tab, and add that budget in there. Now keep in mind, this one's not copied to the grant. Okay, so if I awarded an application into grant tracking in this funding opportunity, it wouldn't come over. It's not linked or copied to the grant yet. It's a brand new form. So I'm gonna go test it first. You really should not link your form too soon. So I shouldn't get in a hurry and link it so I can take my application clear to the claim. I want to make sure that it's looking like a decent budget first at the application level. You really should approve the application budget first. At this point, when you're building a budget for a real program, you should already have a feel and know, if you need a grid or a multi-list, and you should be able to kind of picture what it's going to look like at the claim and know what you need. If you're not there yet, you need to go test. Make sure you have a good test program area, test funding opportunity, and create multiple budgets so you really understand what you're building. But you really want to make sure the application budget is capturing the data you need and change anything, tweak anything you need to before you link it to the grant. You want the grant budget to look just like your application budget. You don't want to link it too soon. If linking doesn't make sense to you right now, and you're not sure what I'm referring to, go back and watch the previous admin training videos, but a really important one on linking is the preparing for grant tracking training video in phase 3. That'll help you with that. But I've talked a lot about linking these forms in different videos. Again, at this point, when we're looking at budgets, we should be very comfortable building standard forms first. So now it's time to test. I'm going to go ahead and log in and find my application as the tester. Here we go, ready to test. Here's my new budget. So the grid, very specific rows, I could skip one. What you have to understand about this this grid and the rows always being here is they're always going to show in the claim, even if I don't have one. I'm just going to enter some totals in here. We're going to see my justification. Oops, my budget justification. And then my calculations will update once I click save. So that's my grid. I've got some different functionality going on, different options. So it's important to know that when this section pulls into the claim, all 4 rows will show. Because I didn't sit there and click add. They were already there for me. And this is where you really need to think about what your needs are for your program. You'll see up here only what I add will show in the claim. And of course, if it was approved. So this is where you're going to name and add the positions of the people here. So I'm going to add a couple rows. I've added a couple rows to my budget here. So as you can see, it ends up looking like a grid, kind of just like this one, except it was user defined, meaning the applicant added those rows. And I could continue adding more rows. So each application would end up looking different. You know, they would be able to list all of their employees or all of their different equipment items, and they can make it unique, where a grid is very specific, and again, it's based on your needs. What you need to understand is these standard sections will not pull into the claim. These are both budget sections, so they will. And if you like this, you know, you're ready to link and go to the next step in testing. If not, you don't need to link it yet. You know, go make your edits, go put some instructions, move things around. This is your time when this budget hasn't, you know, been used for real data and it's a brand new form. This is your time. Make your edits before you link it to the grant. So I'm going to pretend like it looks great. I love it. I'm ready to go. Okay. I'm going to go back into the form creator and I'm going to actually link this to the grant. Here we go. I have it over on my other tab. So I've tested it. It looks great. I'm going to go into the form properties and click link with grants. And again, I have done a training video on this, so I'm going to go through this portion kind of quickly. We can see that it's now copied to the grant or linked. And now I'm going to go to my funding opportunity. And this is that important step of making sure the correct grant budget is in there. So I'm going to go to the grant. This one has that budget. See, that was an other budget. So I have to remove that and make sure I have the correct budget in here, because that was a brand new form. Now, had I used the original budget, I wouldn't have had to worry about linking it again. Once a form's linked, it's always linked. It's only with your brand new forms. And in this case, this was very much a brand new budget. You can see it's now marked that it's copied to the grant. So I'm going to go add this form, and it's nice to kind of copy, and then you can do a search for it by name if you have lots of forms in your system. But what I have to do is I have to add it to the grant tab of my funding opportunity. Okay, so you can see I've now added my budget, so I'm ready to go on to the next step. Now the next step, remember that application was still sitting out there in editing. So I'm going to go ahead and get it submitted in, go through the review process, and I'll get that application ready to award into grant tracking. Here I am in final approval. I've submitted in my application. I've got the approved budget. Again, this is just a test, so you don't actually have to go through the review process on your test. You could practice negotiation and things like that with your budget, but what we really want to do is get into grant tracking and test the claims. We want to see what this budget looks like at the claim level. So I am going to award. This pop-up is really important. It's making sure you have all your forms copied to the grant that you need to. Again, I just did that with my budget, so I'm ready to go, and always take a test in first. So now I've created a grant. I'm going to go look at the grant budget. Very first, before we start the claim, we're going to go make sure first of all, we have the right budget in the grant. The data came over. We don't have any extra budgets in here that we weren't supposed to have. Everything looks great. Okay, so my grant looks great. In order for the grantee to actually come in, which is my tester, to come in and submit a claim and see what it looks like at the claim level, I'm going to put this in underway status so I can log in as that tester and actually see this grant. Okay, now it's time to test it at the claim. We're almost done. Okay, so now I've logged in as that tester. So I'm logged in as the grantee, looking at my grant. My security on this budget is grantor edit only, which means as the grantee, I can see the budget, but I can't change it unless you would unlock it through negotiation for me. So this is what my budget looks like. Again, these two sections were my budget sections, right? So now I'm going to go see what it looks like at the claim. So I'm going to go claim reimbursement, and then here's my reimbursement form. Here is how it was defined. So this is the reimbursement based on that budget. Each budget reimbursement can look totally different. You don't actually build the reimbursement form at the claim. The reimbursement form is a system form, and it's all based on how you built your budget as to how it appears here. For example, if I wouldn't have added match to my budget, none of these columns would have been here. I did, so now I have these extra columns. All of these rows, these were the multi-list. So this is where I said they only see the rows they added for a multi-list, versus my grid, my equipment grid, shows all 4 rows, including the ones that I didn't have. So again, think back to your requirements. If you allow them to move funds around, things like that will determine what type of section you need for your budget. When I talk about categories and line items, this is what I call a category. So in this case, salary and fringe is a category. Equipment is a category, and it could have went on to travel. And then my line items are underneath. So this is a line item budget. Had I just wanted a grand total for salary, a grand total for equipment, and not held them to the line items, I would have still had them give me the line item detail, but that would not have been my true budget section. I would have defined that as a standard section and just built a total as a single value and just pulled in my salary total to that section, and then it would pull in the salary total. And then I would have had an equipment standard section to track the detail that they're going to add all the detail to, and then an equipment like true budget section that just pulls the grand total. And it would have looked entirely different at the claim. It would have just pulled an equipment total, and they could claim against that total. So that's a category budget. And then you have the bare minimum reimbursement form, where you have basically all your sections at the budget are standard informational sections, and just the grand total is your true budget section. And it would be 1 row, just total budget, expenses this period versus match. Of course, I would think you would have to have a different claim form, which you could define to track the details. And most every claim process includes like claim supporting documentation for attachments. But this is really how you get to see that budget all the way through. You really have to link it, make sure you set up your grant tab appropriately, and test it all the way through the process. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information, but you'll get really good at it if you practice and just keep testing. Thank you for watching.